Hello and welcome to the presentation on doing ethnographic fieldwork. This presentation is meant to give you an idea of how we conduct social science, science of people and their social interactions. And the presentation is subtitled Measuring Knowledge and Skill in South India because after I introduce you to the ideas behind ethnographic fieldwork, I will give you an example of my own experience working in quote-unquote the field with the population I lived with in Karnataka, South India. Ethnography aims to describe the nature of those who are studied through writing. This can take many forms. It can include travel accounts, magazine articles, recipes, songs, any way that you try to understand something through writing or describe something through writing, we consider this to be an ethnography. Some of my favorite ethnographies include Coming of Age in Samoa. This was published by Margaret Mead in 1928, and it really shocked America when it was published because she was writing about the sexual behavior of adolescent girls, and she wanted to understand whether the trials and tribulations of adolescence, as it was understood in the U.S., if these were human universals. And it turns out that young women in Samoa have a very different adolescent experience than young women in the United States. Claude Lévi-Strauss is a very famous French anthropologist. He wrote this book called The Raw and the Cooked, and it was about transformations and using mythology to transform understandings into practice, and he was a proponent of structural anthropology, which we don't have time to talk about in this course. This is a great book by Elizabeth Fernea. She was the wife of an anthropologist, and now she's in fact a more famous anthropologist than her husband. They're living in an Iraqi village in the 1970s, and she wrote about the women's behavior and some of the issues that the women were facing at this time. And another really fun one to read, I recommend highly, is called Gang Leader for a Day. It's actually about a sociologist, but he wanted to understand the question, what is it like to be black and poor outside of Chicago? And there's some very funny accounts of when he tries to go up to individuals and ask them this question and how he comes around to answering this question in a more thoughtful way. So that's ethnography, but what is fieldwork? Fieldwork is considered to be the on-site collection of observations in an uncontrolled environment. Traditionally, the field as it is understood to anthropologists is somewhere outside of your common experiences. The idea is that you're able to see more clearly what's going on in a society if you're not enculturated into that society. This is changing more and more. So here's some examples of ethnographic fieldwork. In the top left, we see E. Evans Pritchard with the Zande. He was studying magic and witchcraft. In the upper middle, we see Bronislaw Malinowski with the Trobriand Islanders. You can see myself with the Chimane at the communal fishing event on the upper right. Lower left, we see Margaret Mead here typing up her notes in Samoa. And this is a very common view of an anthropologist. We oftentimes like to show the pictures of ourselves interacting with other cultures, but a large part of our job is typing up notes and writing analyses. In the middle, on the bottom, this is Napoleon Chagnon with one of the Yanomamo, photo taken fairly recently. And the bottom right, this is Charlie. Charlie was my research assistant, an undergraduate student who came to the field with me for a couple of months when I was living in South India. So what do you need to do field work, all of you budding anthropologists? First thing you need to do is to pick a question. Remember, science is about testing hypotheses, trying to figure out what our assumptions about the world is, what are our understandings about the world, and trying to increase the knowledge that we have. So you have to pick a question first. That's sometimes the easiest part. The harder part can be figuring out how you are going to answer the question. So, where are you going to do it? How are you going to collect information? Who are you going to talk to, or what are you going to measure? Some logistics, how are you going to get there? Are there diseases? Is there warfare? What are some logistical issues you might encounter? And how you analyze your data or evaluate your data. How will you take all of this hard work that you've done and find an answer to your question? So my question when I was going to do my dissertation research several years ago in South India, my question was, how does culture change over time? We know that it does. We've discussed cultural evolution in our What is Evolution lecture. But to delve more deeply into this question, we have to understand two things. First of all, what do we mean by culture? We have to understand what we're studying before we can even begin to study it. So in our case, it's a fairly easy question to answer. Culture is any information acquired via social learning. So any information that you've learned from somebody else, this is considered to be culture. So this can include skills like knot tying, values like religious preferences, knowledge about how to send a text message. I have to update this picture. And beliefs. The picture on the lower right, this meat looks very tasty, good looking steaks, but you probably feel differently about it if I told you that it's horse meat. So our beliefs are also learned from other individuals. This is a butchery in France where people have much less aversion to eating horse meat than we do, and you can buy horse meat in the butcher shop. So we're going to start off with the assumption, this comes from previous work done in the field. Other researchers have found that our psychology affects social learning. There is massive amounts of information in the world that other people have. Their haircuts, their accents, their pace of walking, their postures. And there's far more information than we could ever possibly hope to acquire. We do acquire information from other individuals, and we do so using these quick and dirty rules of thumb, these psychological rules of thumb. And we know that how we learn can affect what we learn. And so we want to understand how what we learn affects the body of knowledge in a population. So how do people use these psychological rules of thumb, like copy the majority or copy a successful person when you're trying to learn something new? How does this affect what different behaviors, values, skills, beliefs that we learn? And how does this affect the body of knowledge overall? How people tie their shoes and how people send text messages and what kinds of meat they eat. These things are changing, they're in flux. So how do learning preferences shape that change? Alright, so I've got to go through my steps of research. Pick a location. I chose South India. More specifically, I chose this town called Gonikappal. It's in the state of Karnataka. You can see Bengaluru. This is the Indian name for Bangalore on the map, and you can see that I'm just in the Green Hills, about 6 hours southwest of Bangalore. And here's the little region that I was living in Gonikappal on the right, and you can see that green band, that's the forest. And I was working with a tribe called the Jenu Karuba who lived in this forest, and they specialize in collecting wild honey. So I want to understand how this knowledge and behavior about collecting wild honey is going to change over time. So it's a pretty good place to do it. It's a fairly straightforward body of knowledge that I can measure and measure change in. What methods am I going to use? Well, first of all, I'm going to census the population. I'm going to go around to all the different villages and figure out where people are, what they know, who likes me, who doesn't, where it might be a good idea to settle down and study this in more depth. And then I'm going to do these other steps, but I would like to tell you about them slide by slide. So here's me, younger me, doing the census in one of the villages. I went around to every household and asked about all of the individuals and whether they had collected honey, other people who weren't home, if they had collected honey, to get an idea of where the information is at. Next, I engaged in something called participant observation, and this took about 6 months, actually. Participant observation means that you are participating in an activity, but you're also observing it at the same time, and this is the bread and butter of anthropology. We go out, we participate with other individuals in usually unfamiliar activities and try to observe something about that while we're participating. So I went out honey collecting. I hung out with young boys after school. I hung around the shop and engaged in conversations and listened to what people were saying and how they were talking about collecting honey. And I walked with them through the forest and paid attention to how they find out where the honey is, for example, and how they know how to make a smoky torch to help create smoke to stun the bees so they get stung less, and how they learn to climb trees. All of these things. I was a participant, but also an observer. The point of this is I'm going to be creating a questionnaire, and I want to ask people what they know about honey collecting, so I myself had to become an expert so I could test others, just like I do for Anthropology 105. So here's me out honey collecting. This is the dry season, not too much honey around in the area at this time, but this is the village chief who was playing a traditional song for me. And here's some more pictures from me out honey collecting with the guys. So how am I going to choose a sample? And why do I need to choose a sample? Luckily, in the villages I was working in, I got to ask almost everybody about their honey collecting behavior, from 6-year-olds to 65-year-olds on up. You can see Charlie here doing a questionnaire with a young boy, and there's his translator working with him, asking the questions for him. So luckily I got to ask most everybody. When we want to generalize from only being able to ask a certain proportion of the population, we have to be careful about who we talk to. If I wanted to know about smoking habits in the United States, and I went down to Walmart on a Saturday night and only asked those people, that's not a general picture of the United States. I would need to draw a larger, more random sample, so perhaps from the US Census. So I can use statistical techniques to make larger assumptions about the population and all. But luckily, like I said, I wasn't too restricted by that. So I talked to girls, I talked to women, I talked to all of the boys, and I talked to all of the men. And you might be wondering, well, in this area of South India, people aren't always sure about their ages, so how do you know how old people are? Well, my youngest participant was 6 years old. You can see him here on the right. His name is Chinana. And I know he's 6 because that's about the same time that a child's arm is long enough to reach over the top of his head and touch his ear. And you can see among these boys who are 6, 8, 10, and 12 how the arm is getting longer. And I'm pretty sure that you could reach over the top of your head and touch the top of your ear. But I recommend you try this if you have children or nieces and nephews, or you're a teacher or something. Ask the kids to touch their ears. So this is how I knew that they were 6 and old enough to participate in my study. Younger than 6, they really weren't capable of answering my questions. Okay, so I used my expert knowledge collected during all of my participant observation, and I created a questionnaire, and I went around all of the villages and asked everybody to respond to the questions about various aspects of honey collecting, like how many queens are in a hive and what types of flowers do the bees like to eat, for example. I also had some practical tests, because reporting on behavior is one thing, but how do you ask people how well do you climb trees? So what I actually did was have them climb trees and have them make smoky torches and have them taste test honey, so I could get some practical measures of their behavior as well. And you'll see this in the reading in both Peoples of the Tundra and Yanomamo, how it's important for us to observe and measure practical behaviors as they're occurring and not just get self-reports. Just in case you're curious, here's me and Charlie outside of our house in the forest. It was very glamorous living. Field research is quite different. It's because you're taking yourself out of a culturally comfortable situation. It can be very different. So let's sum up with what did I learn. I'll just give you an example here of medicinal knowledge. So I asked everybody about a recipe that they knew for a medicine to help cure a cough or cold. And it boiled down basically to you heat some honey in hot water and put herbs and spices in there. Very similar if you've ever had a cup of hot water with lemon and honey to cure a sore throat, very similar. So I asked people, have you ever had this? And about 70% of people had taken the medicine. And then I asked them, have you ever, what's the recipe? And a little over 60% people who had been exposed to the knowledge knew the recipe. Out of those 62, I asked, how have you ever made the medicine yourself? And about almost 50% of people who had who knew the recipe had made the medicine. So this is pretty great. So about 50% of the population in these 5 villages that I was working in knew how to make a honey collecting medicine. So we would consider this to be very stable knowledge. People are doing it, other people are observing, they're remembering what they see, and they're copying that behavior and doing it themselves. So people see the medicine being made, they remember the recipe, and then they'll make it for others and participate in this process of cultural transmission. There is different medicinal knowledge about honey collecting, or I'm sorry, about using honey as a medicine. Very specialized knowledge, only held by the gurus. So I ran around to all of the villages in the area, it's about 28, and I was doing the same thing, asking who are the gurus, what did they know, and was that knowledge getting passed on? And it turns out that no, it wasn't. In fact, the last guru in the area was practicing in 1985. And what happened after this time was that free medicinal care came into the area through government hospitals. So nobody trained as a guru for 1 generation, nobody copied the behavior, and now that knowledge is lost forever. So this is an example of how we can do ethnographic field work, do anthropological social science, to ask questions, to test hypotheses, and to try to get real-world information about social science questions, like how does culture change over time, and how do processes of learning affect that? In this case, this apprentice-guru relationship was interrupted for 1 generation, and it was very unstable, and we lost the knowledge as a result. But because the home remedy is practiced in almost every household, it's very stable. So different traditions of knowledge transmission have had different results. So thank you for listening, and go ahead and move on. We'll return to some anthropological and evolutionary theory in the next few presentations.